The ship docked at the Valorian Interspecies Academy with a soft hum, and Elena Vasquez pressed her face against the viewport like a child seeing snow for the first time. She had dreamed of this moment for years, ever since humanity made first contact with the galactic community. And now she was here, the first human ever accepted into the most prestigious xenobiology program in known space. The station was enormous, a spinning wheel of metal and glass that held thousands of students from hundreds of different worlds. And Elena felt her heart racing as she gathered her single bag and stepped onto the boarding platform. Aliens of every shape and size moved through the corridors around her, and she tried not to stare too obviously at the towering crystalline beings, the floating gas sacks, the many-legged creatures that clicked along the floor. Some of them stared back at her with expressions she could not read, and she heard whispers in languages her translator could not fully process. Words like Death Worlder and Persistence Predator and Dangerous. Elena kept her head high and her smile friendly, because that was what humans did when they were nervous and far from home. The B Academy had assigned her quarters in a section designed for oxygen breathers with standard gravity needs, and she was grateful for that small comfort as she unpacked her few belongings. A photograph of her family went on the small desk, along with a worn paperback book she had carried across the stars, a collection of old Earth stories about humans and the animals they had loved. She touched the cover gently before heading out to find her first class. The corridors of the academy were clearly labeled in dozens of scripts, and her translator glasses helped her navigate toward the lecture hall for Advanced Predator Studies. This was the class she had most wanted to take, the reason she had fought so hard for acceptance here, because Elena had always believed that understanding predators was the key to understanding any ecosystem. She arrived early and chose a seat in the middle of the room, not too close to seem aggressive and not too far back to seem afraid. Other students filtered in slowly, and Elena noticed how none of them sat near her, being that looked like a walking plant. She would later learn they were called Florians, settled several rows away and kept glancing at her with what might have been anxiety. A gelatinous creature she recognized as Aquilix squeezed through the door and wobbled toward the far corner. Then a tall reptilian student strode in with obvious confidence, scales gleaming under the lights, and took a seat in the front row as if he owned the place. Elena smiled at each of them, but none smiled back. The instructor arrived last, and Elena felt her breath catch at the sight of him. Instructor Vrethkan was a crystalline, nearly 3 meters tall, with a body that seemed made of living glass and gemstone, faceted eyes that reflected the light in rainbow patterns, and a voice that resonated like wind through hollow stones. He moved to the front of the room and regarded his students with what Elena interpreted as cold assessment. "Welcome to Advanced Predator Studies," he announced, and his voice needed no amplification to fill the space. "This course will teach you to identify, understand, and survive encounters with the most dangerous life forms in the galaxy." His many eyes swept across the room and stopped on Elena. "I see we have a new addition this term," he continued, and there was something in his tone that Elena did not like. A human, the first of her kind to attend this academy. Every head in the room turned toward her, and Elena felt the weight of alien attention pressing down on her shoulders. "Tell me, human," Vrethkan said, "what do you know about predators?" Elena cleared her throat and answered as calmly as she could manage. "On my world, we lived alongside predators for millions of years," she said. "We learned to understand them, to respect them, and sometimes to form bonds with them." Strange sound rippled through the room, the alien equivalent of skeptical laughter. The reptilian student in the front row turned to look at her with obvious disdain. "Bonds with predators?" he repeated, his voice a deep rumble. "What foolishness is this?" "It is not foolishness," Elena replied, keeping her voice steady. Humans have partnered with predator species for tens of thousands of years. Wolves became our hunting companions. Wild cats became our protectors against smaller predators. Birds of prey became our eyes in the sky. Vrethkan made a sound that her translator interpreted as dismissive amusement. Charming mythology, he said, but this is a scientific institution, and we deal in facts rather than fairy tales. Predators are not friends. They are not companions. They are biological machines designed to hunt and kill. Elena wanted to argue, but she recognized that this was not the time or place. She had come here to learn, not to fight. So she simply nodded and folded her hands in her lap. The lecture continued for another hour, covering the classification systems used to rank predatory species across the galaxy. And Elena took careful notes even as she felt Vrethkan's attention returning to her again and again. When the class ended, the other students hurried out without speaking to her, and she gathered her things slowly. Lost in thought, "Human," Vrethkan called out before she could leave. A moment, Elena turned to face him, and the instructor approached until he loomed over her, his crystalline body catching the light. "I have read about your species," he said, and his voice was quieter now, but no less cold. "The galactic databases classify you as persistence predators from a high-gravity death world. They say you are dangerous, that you feel no fear, that you domesticate monsters." He leaned closer, and Elena held her ground, even though every instinct told her to step back. "I do not believe such things," Vrethkan continued. "I believe humans are simply good at telling stories about themselves. Tomorrow, we have a practical demonstration, and I think it will be very educational for everyone to see how a human truly reacts when faced with real predators." Elena met his faceted gaze and refused to look away. "I look forward to it." "Instructor," she said. Vrethkan made another dismissive sound and turned away, his crystalline body chiming softly as he moved. Elena left the lecture hall with her heart pounding and her mind racing. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew that she would face it the same way humans had always faced the unknown, with curiosity, with courage, and with an open hand. She returned to her quarters and sat on her small bed, looking at the photograph of her family and the old book of stories. And she wondered if the galaxy would ever understand what it truly meant to be human. Outside her window, the stars wheeled slowly past, ancient and cold and beautiful. And Elena Vasquez smiled despite her fears. Tomorrow would come, whatever it held, and she would be ready. The next morning arrived too quickly, and Elena woke with a knot of worry in her stomach that she could not shake. She dressed in her simple academy uniform and braided her dark hair back from her face, then stood before the small mirror and gave herself a stern look. "You are a Vasquez," she told her reflection, "and we do not run from anything." The words helped a little, and she squared her shoulders before heading out to meet whatever instructor Vrethkan had planned for her. The lecture hall for today's demonstration was different from the regular classroom. It was a secure observation theater with reinforced walls, thick transparent barriers, and heavy blast doors that sealed with an ominous hiss. When the last student entered, Elena noticed armed security drones hovering near the ceiling, and she felt the knot in her stomach grow tighter. The other students seemed even more nervous than usual, and the Florian was actually trembling, its leaves shaking with visible fear. Even the arrogant reptilian student, whose name Elena had learned was Torvin, seemed less confident than before. His scales pressed flat against his body in what she recognized as a defensive posture only. Instructor Vrethkan appeared calm as he moved to the center of the room and raised his crystalline arms for attention. "Today we will observe living specimens of one of the galaxy's most dangerous predator species," he announced, and his voice echoed off the reinforced walls. "The Kethrani shadow cubs?" A gasp went through the room, and Elena saw the Quillic student actually flatten itself, Against the floor in terror, she had read about the Kathrani in her studies. They were apex predators from a death world, even more hostile than Earth, responsible for the destruction of 3 colony settlements in the past century. Even juvenile Kathrani were considered extremely dangerous, and most research facilities refused to keep them in captivity. "Do not be alarmed," Vrethkon continued, though his tone suggested he was quite pleased by their fear. "The specimens are contained behind multiple layers of security, and you are in no danger as long as you remain in your seats." He gestured toward a large containment field at the front of the room, and the opaque barrier shimmered and became transparent. Elena leaned forward in her seat, her fear momentarily forgotten in a surge of pure scientific curiosity. 3 Kathrani shadow cubs paced inside the containment field, and they were the most beautiful creatures she had ever seen. They moved on 6 powerful legs, their bodies covered in fur so black it seemed to absorb the light around them, and their eyes glowed with soft bioluminescence in shades of blue and purple. They were about the size of large dogs from Earth, with sleek muscles rippling beneath. Their dark coats and retractable claws that clicked against the floor as they walked. Elena could see the deadly potential in every line of their bodies. But she could also see something else, something that made her heart ache with recognition. They were young, and they were scared, and they were alone. "Observe their hunting posture," Vrethkon lectured, pointing toward the cubs with one gleaming arm. "Notice how they spread out to cover more area, how their eyes track movement constantly, how their bodies remain low to the ground in preparation for attack." The cubs were indeed doing all of these things. But Elena saw it differently than the instructor. She saw 3 young animals in an unfamiliar environment, surrounded by strange beings and strange smells, trying desperately to understand what was happening and whether they were safe. She had seen the same behavior in frightened dogs, in cornered cats, in any young predator that found itself in a situation it could not control. "Can you tell us about their social structures?" Elena asked, her voice cutting through the tense silence. Vrethkon turned his faceted gaze toward her, and she could feel his disapproval like a physical weight. "Kathrani have no social structures," he replied. "They are solitary hunters who tolerate each other only during mating season. These cubs were captured from different locations and share no bonds whatsoever." Elena wanted to argue. She could see the way the cubs positioned themselves to watch each other's blind spots, the way they communicated with small chirps and ear movements. But she held her tongue where Vrethkon had already dismissed her once, and she doubted he would listen now. "Now," the instructor continued, and there was a strange gleam in his crystalline body that Elena did not trust. "Let us observe how these predators react to potential prey." He touched a control panel, and a small drone emerged from the wall and flew into the containment field. The cubs reacted instantly, their hunting instincts taking over as they tracked the drone with their glowing eyes and coordinated their movements without any visible communication. Within seconds, they had cornered the drone and torn it apart with their claws, moving so fast that Elena could barely follow their motions. The other students cried out in fear, and Torvin actually fell out of his seat in his haste to move away from the barrier. Elena remained where she was, watching the cubs with narrowed eyes as they sniffed at the destroyed drone and made sounds of confusion when they found no food inside. "Impressive, is it not?" Vrethkon asked, and he was looking directly at Elena now. "This is what real predators look like. Human, not the tame pets of your fairy tales, but efficient killing machines that will destroy anything that moves." Elena opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, an alarm began to blare throughout the room. Red lights flashed, and a computerized voice announced a containment malfunction in calm, measured tones. The barrier around the Kathrani cubs flickered once, twice, and then disappeared entirely for a single heartbeat. Nothing happened. Then the cubs bolted from their containment area and into the lecture hall. And the room erupted into pure chaos. Students screamed and ran for the exits, climbing over each other in their desperation to escape. And the security drones powered up their weapons, but hesitated to fire with so many panicked bodies in the way. Elena saw Torvin shove the trembling Florian aside in his rush to reach the door. And she saw the Quillic squeeze itself into a crack in the wall too small for the cubs to follow. She saw Instructor Vrethkin standing perfectly still by his control panel. And in that moment she understood everything. There had been no malfunction. This was a test, his test, designed to prove that humans were no different from any other prey species in the galaxy. He wanted to see her run, wanted to see her scream, wanted to destroy the mythology of human courage once and for all. Elena looked at the cubs, who had spread out across the room and were tracking the fleeing students with their glowing eyes. And she made a decision. She did not run. Instead, she slowly lowered herself in her seat, making her body smaller and less threatening, and she began to breathe in long, steady rhythms. One of the cubs turned its head toward her, and their eyes met across the chaos of the lecture hall. Elena smiled, and she waited. The chaos around Elena seemed to fade into the background as she focused entirely on the cub that was watching her. It was the smallest of the three, with eyes that glowed a soft purple instead of blue, and it had frozen in place when she did not run like the others. Lena knew that running was the worst thing she could do right now. Every predator instinct in those cubs would respond to fleeing prey, and she would never outrun something built for hunting on a death world. But staying still was only the first step she needed to communicate, to reach across the vast gap between species and find some common ground. And she needed to do it quickly, before the security drones decided to open fire regardless of the risk. Elena slowly lowered her gaze, looking at the cub without staring directly into its eyes, because she knew that direct eye contact was a challenge. In most predator species, she let her shoulders relax and her breathing slow until her body language spoke only of calm acceptance. Then she began to hum. It was a low sound, barely audible over the screaming and the alarms. A simple tune that her mother used to sing to her when she was small and afraid of storms. She did not know if the cubs could even hear it, but she kept humming anyway, letting the vibration move through her chest and into the air around her. The purple-eyed cub tilted its head, its ears rotating forward like satellite dishes searching for a signal. And it took a single step toward her. Lena did not move, did not flinch, did not stop her quiet song across the room. The other two cubs had cornered a group of students near the main door, and Elena could hear their terrified cries as they pressed against the sealed exit. But the purple-eyed cub was no longer interested in them. Its attention was fixed entirely on Elena, and she could see confusion replacing the hunting instinct in its glowing gaze. She slowly extended her hand, palm facing down, fingers loose and relaxed, and she held it out to the side rather than reaching toward the cub. This was the way you introduced yourself to a strange dog on Earth, by offering without demanding, by letting the animal choose whether to approach or retreat. The cub crept closer, its 6 legs moving in perfect silence, its dark fur rippling like shadows come to life. It was close enough now that Elena could smell it, a scent like ozone and earth, and something wild that made the ancient parts of her brain want to run. She stayed perfectly still. The cub sniffed her hand, its whiskers brushing against her skin, and she felt the warmth of its breath on her fingers. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the cub made a sound that Elena had never heard before, a soft, chirping trill that rose and fell like a question, and it pushed its head against her. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes as she gently scratched behind the cub's ears, feeling the incredible softness of its fur beneath her fingers. The cub chirped again, louder this time, and it pressed closer to her, rubbing its head against her arm like a cat seeking attention across the room. The other two cubs heard the sound and went still. Elena watched as they turned away from the cornered students and began to move toward her, their postures shifting from hunting mode to something else entirely. The students they had been stalking did not move, frozen in disbelief as the deadly predators simply walked away from them. The largest cub reached Elena first, its blue eyes bright with curiosity, and it sniffed at her thoroughly before making its own chirping sound and pushing. Against her other hand, she laughed. She could not help it, and the sound seemed to delight the cubs even more. The third cub, who had eyes that shifted between blue and purple depending on the light, did not wait for an invitation. It simply climbed into her lap, all 6 legs and dark fur and purring warmth, and curled up against her stomach like it had always belonged there. The purple-eyed cub made a sound of protest at this invasion of what it clearly considered its territory, and it scrambled up to drape itself across Alana's shoulders, its tail wrapping around her arm. The blue-eyed cub, not to be outdone, wedged itself against her side and began to knead her jacket with its retractable claws, purring so loudly that she could feel the vibration in her bones. Elena sat in the middle of the lecture hall, covered in deadly apex predators, and she had never felt more at peace. The security drones hovered uncertainly, their weapons still powered up, but with no clear target, and the students who had been fleeing stood frozen at the edges of the room. Even the computerized alarms seemed to grow quieter, as if the very station itself was holding its breath. Elena looked up and found Instructor Vrethkan staring at her with an expression that her translator could not identify. His crystalline body had gone completely still, and she could see her own reflection fractured 1,000 times in his faceted eyes. "How?" he asked, and for the first time since she had arrived, his voice held no coldness or dismissal, only pure bewilderment. Elena stroked the cub in her lap and felt its purr intensify beneath her hand. "They are young," she said simply. "They are scared, and they are alone, and they needed someone to tell them that everything would be all right." She looked at the other students, still pressed against the walls in terror, and she felt a wave of sadness wash over her. "On Earth, we learned a long time ago that predators are not evil," she continued. "They are just creatures trying to survive in a difficult universe. And if you approach them with respect and patience and kindness, sometimes they will let you into their world." The blue-eyed cub lifted its head and licked her cheek with a rough tongue, and Elena laughed again despite the tears now streaming down her face. "Sometimes," she said, "they will even love you back." The security drones finally lowered their weapons, and the sealed doors hissed open to reveal a squad of armed guards who stopped dead at the sight before Thema. Small human woman sat in the middle of a lecture hall, surrounded by 3 of the most dangerous juvenile predators in the galaxy, and she was crying and laughing and petting them like they were nothing more than oversized kittens. One of the guards turned to Instructor Vrethkan and asked what had happened, but the crystalline being had no answer to give. For the first time in his long academic career, Vrethkan had witnessed something that his scientific mind could not explain, and he found himself wondering if perhaps the humans were not so mythological after all. The hours that followed the incident in the lecture hall were among the strangest of Elena's. Life security teams surrounded her but kept their distance, watching in amazement as the 3 Kethrani cubs refused to leave her side. When handlers arrived with containment equipment, the cubs growled and pressed closer to Elena, their fur standing on end and their claws extending in clear warning. When the handlers tried to approach anyway, the largest cub, the one with the bright blue eyes, actually lunged at them, snapping its jaws inches from their reaching hands before retreating back to Elena's side. "They will not let anyone near her," one of the security officers reported into his communicator. "We need a new approach." Elena sat on the floor of the lecture hall with the cubs draped around her, and she spoke in a calm, steady voice. "They are protecting me," she explained. They have decided that I am part of their group, and they will not let perceived threats get close. She looked up at the circle of armed guards and confused scientists that surrounded her, and she kept her hands moving gently across the cub's fur. If you want them to calm down, you need to back away and give us space, she said. They can sense your fear and your tension, and it is making them nervous. The security team looked at each other with uncertainty, but eventually they followed her instructions and withdrew to the edges of the room within minutes. The cubs had relaxed again, their growls fading into contented purrs as Elena continued to pet them and murmur soft words of comfort. The Academy's central AI had been analyzing the situation since it began, and now it spoke through the room's speakers in a neutral, measured tone. Analysis of the human subject reveals several factors that may explain the Kethrani response. The AI announced, human body temperature averages between 36 and 37 degrees Celsius, which falls within the optimal comfort range for Kethrani thermoregulation. Elena listened with interest as the AI continued. Human vocalizations during the incident included low-frequency sounds that closely match frequencies produced by Kethrani maternal units during nurturing behaviors. The human heartbeat rhythm also corresponds to pacifying signals used between bonded Kethrani family groups. One of the scientists made a note on a datapad, but the AI was not finished. However, it said, these biological factors alone do not fully explain them. Observe bonding behavior. Additional analysis suggests the presence of an unknown variable in the human subject's approach that cannot be quantified through standard metrics. Elena smiled and scratched behind the purple-eyed cub's ears. It is called affection, she said, and it cannot be measured because it is not a physical thing. It is a choice to care about another living being, even when that being is different from you. The cub chirped happily and rubbed its head against her hand. Word of the incident spread through the Academy like wildfire, and within hours it had reached the wider galactic network. Elena's face appeared on news broadcasts across 100 worlds, accompanied by footage from the lecture hall. Security cameras that showed the moment the cubs climbed into her lap. Commentators argued about what it meant, and experts offered theories ranging from pheromone manipulation to some kind of unknown human telepathy. But the footage spoke for itself. A lone human sitting calmly among deadly predators, petting them and laughing while the galaxy watched in disbelief. Student messages flooded Elena's Academy account, most of them filled with questions and wonder, though some contained fear and suspicion. The Florian student who had fainted during the incident sent a long apology for not helping, and Elena replied with reassurance that there was nothing to apologize for. Even Torvin, the arrogant reptilian who had shoved others aside in his panic, sent a brief message acknowledging that he had underestimated her. Elena read it and decided to consider it a form of progress. By evening, officials from the Academy Council had arrived to assess the situation, and they brought with them a team of Kethrani specialists who had never actually worked with living specimens. The specialists were astonished to find Elena still sitting on the floor, now surrounded by food containers and water bowls that the cubs had grudgingly allowed others to bring close. They were dehydrated, Elena explained as the specialist watched the blue-eyed cub drink deeply from a bowl. And hungry, no one had thought to feed them properly before the demonstration. There was accusation in her voice, and several officials shifted uncomfortably at her words. The specimens were scheduled for feeding after the demonstration. One of them said, there was no intention to cause them distress. Elena fixed the official with a hard stare that made him take a step backward. They are not specimens, she said firmly. They are living creatures with needs and feelings, and you cannot expect them to behave calmly when they are scared and hungry and trapped in a strange place. The cub in her lap lifted its head and growled softly at the official. As if agreeing with her words, Elena soothed it with a gentle touch and returned her attention to the assembled authorities. "I want to know what is going to happen to them," she said. "They trusted me, and I will not abandon them to cages and experiments." The officials exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for this development. "The Kethrani are classified as dangerous fauna," one of them began. "Standard protocol requires containment and study under controlled conditions." "Standard protocol nearly got everyone in that lecture hall killed," Elena replied, and her voice was steel wrapped in silk. "These cubs need care, not containment. They need space to move and food to eat, and someone who will treat them as the intelligent beings they are." She paused and looked down at the three cubs who had curled around her like she was the center of their universe. "I want to be their guardian," she said. "I want official custody and responsibility for their welfare." Silence fell over the room as the officials processed her. Requested was unprecedented, possibly illegal, and almost certainly dangerous, but as they looked at the human woman sitting peacefully among three apex predators, who purred at her touch and growled at anyone who came too close, they found it very difficult to argue. The decision would take time, they told her, but they would consider her request. Elena nodded and settled into wait, her hands still moving across soft dark fur, her heart still beating in that calm rhythm that the cubs had learned to trust. Whatever came next, she would face it with them by her side. 1 week after the incident that the galactic media was calling First Pack, Elena Vasquez stood before the Academy Council in their great chamber. The room was designed to intimidate, with towering walls of polished stone and seats arranged in rising circles that made the person at the center feel very small. Elena did not feel small. She stood with her shoulders back and her chin high, wearing her simple Academy uniform, and she waited for the council to deliver their verdict behind her. 3 Kethrani shadow cubs sat in perfect stillness, their glowing eyes fixed on the council members with an intensity that made several of them shift uncomfortably in their seats. Cubs had refused to be separated from Elena, even for this official proceeding, and no one had been willing to try forcing the issue. "Elena Vasquez of Earth," the council speaker announced, its voice echoing through the chamber. "This council has reviewed your request for guardianship of the 3 Kethrani specimens, and we have also reviewed the circumstances that led to this unprecedented situation." Elena felt the purple-eyed cub press against her leg, and she reached down to touch its head. Reassuringly, Instructor Vrethkon has admitted to deliberately disabling the containment field during the demonstration, the speaker continued. His actions endangered students and staff and violated multiple Academy protocols. He has been removed from his position and will face further disciplinary action. Elena felt a complicated mix of emotions at this news. She was glad that Vrethkon would face consequences for his cruelty, but she also felt no satisfaction in his downfall. She simply wanted to move forward. "As for your request," the speaker said, and Elena held her breath, "the council has decided, after much debate, to grant you provisional guardianship of the 3 Kethrani cubs." A murmur went through the assembled observers, and Elena felt her heart leap with joy. "However," the speaker added, and Elena's joy became tempered with caution, "this guardianship comes with strict conditions. You will submit to regular oversight. You will participate in ongoing research into human Kethrani bonding, and you will remain on Academy grounds where proper facilities can be provided." Elena nodded her acceptance of these terms, and the speaker continued, "The council also wishes to acknowledge that your actions during the incident prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of life. Your courage and your unusual abilities have given us much to consider about the nature of human-alien relations." The formal proceedings ended shortly after, and Elena walked out of the council chamber with 3 cubs trailing at her heels and a new future stretching out before her. She found Instructor Vrethkan, waiting in the corridor outside his crystalline body, seemed duller than before, the light within him dimmed by what Elena could only interpret as shame. "I came to apologize," he said, and his voice was quiet and uncertain in a way she had never heard before. "What I did was wrong. I wanted to prove that humans were ordinary, that the stories about your species were exaggerations, and I was willing to put lives at risk to satisfy my skepticism." Elena regarded in silence for a long moment, and the cubs pressed close to her legs, watching the crystalline being with wary eyes. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why was it so important to you to prove that we were nothing special?" Vrethkan's faceted eyes shifted with something that might have been pain. "Because if humans truly possess the abilities the stories claim," he said, "then everything I have taught about predator relations for the past century has been wrong. I built my entire career on the belief that predators cannot be reasoned with, cannot be befriended, cannot be anything other than threats to be contained or eliminated." He gestured toward the cubs with one gleaming arm. "And yet, there they are," he continued. "Deadly creatures who would kill anyone else who approached them. Sitting at your feet like trained companions, you did not dominate them or trick them or use technology to control them. You simply showed them kindness, and they chose to follow you." Elena reached down and picked up the smallest cub, cradling it against her chest. "On Earth, we've been doing this for a very long time," she said. "Wolves became dogs because our ancestors sat by fires in the darkness and shared their food with the shadows that circled at the edge of the light. It took generations, but eventually the shadows came to sit beside the fire instead of beyond it." She looked at Vrethkan with compassion rather than anger. "You are not entirely wrong," she said. "Predators are dangerous and they must be respected, but respect does not mean fear, and dangerous does not mean evil." Vrethkan was silent for a long moment, and then he asked the question that Elena had been waiting for. "What do humans want from the galaxy?" he asked. "You have proven that you can befriend monsters. What will you do with that power?" Elena smiled and set the cub back on the ground, where it immediately began to rub against her ankles. "We want what we have always wanted," she said. "We want to not be alone." She looked out the window at the stars drifting past the station. "Countless points of light in the endless dark. Humans evolved on a world that tried to kill us every day," she continued. "We survived by working together, by making allies of creatures that should have been our enemies, by looking at the darkness and refusing to give in to despair." She turned back to Vrethkan. "The galaxy is very big and very cold," she said, "but it does not have to be lonely. If we can learn to sit by the fire together, all of us, then maybe the darkness will not seem so frightening." Vrethkan had no response to that, and Elena did not expect one. She simply nodded to him and walked away, her cubs following close behind. Her new quarters were larger than her old ones, with space for the cubs to run and play and special temperature controls to keep them comfortable. Lena had named them in the days since the incident: Shadow for the one with shifting eyes, Midnight for the blue-eyed one who had first defended her, and Trouble for the purple-eyed cub who had been the first to approach her. Hand Trouble was living up to the name already. Having destroyed 2 chairs and a datapad in the past week, Elena settled onto her bed and opened her warm paperback book, and the cubs arranged themselves around her in what had become their standard configuration, Trouble draped across her shoulders, Midnight curled at her feet, and Shadow sprawled across her lap, demanding belly rubs with increasingly aggressive chirps. She laughed and obliged, and the sound of her laughter mixed with their purring to fill the small room with warmth outside the window. The stars wheeled past in their eternal dance, and somewhere out there, beings on 1,000 worlds were watching footage of a human woman and 3 deadly predators. Trying to understand what they were seeing, Lena did not know what the future held for humanity or for the galaxy they had. joined, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty: humans would face that future the same way they had always faced the unknown, with curiosity, with courage, with open hands and open hearts, ready to make friends with whatever they found in the darkness. And sitting in her quarters with 3 former monsters purring contentedly around her, Elena Vasquez thought that the future looked pretty bright indeed outside. The stars kept turning, ancient and vast and full of possibilities. And the galaxy slowly began to understand something that humans had known all along. The void was not empty. It was just waiting for someone brave enough to reach out and say hello.